So finally in this unit we're looking at the patterns of evolution, and one of the major patterns of evolution is extinction. And there have been 5 mass extinctions, and that's what's shown here on this graph. We're looking at global diversity since the origin of the Earth. And it's not to scale, of course. This part is. So the thing to understand about extinction is that it's the rule, not the exception. In other words, there have been all of these mass extinctions, and there will continue to be mass extinctions. In fact, some believe that there's a mass extinction occurring right now because of our own activity. This figure is really cool, and if you concentrate on studying what it's showing, first of all, this one was created using global diversity. In other words, all the species lumped together. This one was created using the number of families, which is a slightly different way of looking at it, but it pretty much shows the same thing. All of the 5 mass extinctions are here and labeled, but it also is really interesting the way it's color-coded to show the Cambrian fauna and the Paleozoic fauna. And by the way, fauna refers to animal life, right? Flora is plant life and fauna is animal life. Modern fauna, and what's interesting there is to follow the modern fauna all the way back to the Cambrian and see that the modern fauna had their start in the Cambrian period. So basically everything had its start in the Cambrian period, all fauna. So what I'm asking you to do here is label the geologic periods that correspond to each extinction event. So just like they did here, just to kind of put it into your mind, it'd be a good exercise to label each one of these on this graph, because they're not labeled on this graph. So if we transfer, the end Ordovician is here, the late Devonian is here, the end Permian, and look how big that is. That's the one they call the Great Dying, where 95% of species in the ocean died and 70% of land species, terrestrial species, died. That's a huge one at the end of the Permian. End Triassic and end Cretaceous, which is the famous one that everybody knows about. And we know the most about that one because it is more recent, and we know it was caused by an asteroid impact. There's a crater off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico that is probably the impact crater from that asteroid strike. That crater dates to about 66 million years ago, which is when this actually happened. Even though it says 65 here, they just kind of rounded to 66 to 65. And there's this little blip right here too. So there have been and there are other little blips that aren't being shown on this graph. So there have been other mass extinction events, but not as massive mass extinction events as the 5 that are counted as the 5 big ones. We don't know what caused all of these, but like I said, we know more about the more recent ones, especially that one 65 million years ago. So also notice that when you look at what's going on here, the general trend is an increase in diversity over time, and you'll notice that the number of species kind of spring back higher than they were before the mass extinction event. So we have a mass extinction event, and then species recover. Mass extinction event, species recover. Huge mass extinction event, species recover, but not. This is the only place where they don't recover before the next one higher than the one before. Another little extinction event at the end of the Triassic, but then we have this huge recovery. So that's just the other thing that I wanted you to note here, is that extinction, you could even think of extinction as kind of helping evolution. And it definitely has an effect on the types of species that are now on the planet. Every one of these extinction events has set the stage for the species that we now have on the planet to be here. So it's a very important pattern of evolution. So the effect of an extinction event is that niches are vacated. In other words, the species that were in niches are now gone. And that means that niches are available for other species to adapt into. and take over, basically. So here we're looking at mammals. These are all the different families of mammals. And if you trace this is a phylogenetic tree, it shows evolutionary relationships, and if you trace back on all these branches, you find that they come together to common ancestry. And so the branching out of lines of evolutionary descent is what's referred to as adaptive radiation. All these different mammal species, or mammal groups, I should say, mammal families, are branching out, or orders actually, they're orders, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, right? They're in the class Mammalia, and so each one of these is a different order. And all these different orders evolved to fill different niches. So that's the idea of adaptive radiation, the branching out of new species from common ancestry to fill available niches. And after extinction events, there are all kinds of available niches. So we see adaptive radiation. After extinction events, we see adaptive radiation of the surviving species. And that's basically what that says. So mammals adaptively radiated following the Cretaceous mass extinction that removed the dinosaurs, in the same way that Darwin's finches adaptively radiated from common ancestry in the Galapagos Islands. And so that's what he realized. That's what he observed. That's what he saw. He knew that same thing applied to species on different continents. And we see here that the same thing applies to the species following mass extinction events. Adaptive radiation can also be referred to as divergent evolution or divergence. The species are diverging from common ancestry. Here we're looking at convergent evolution, which is kind of the opposite idea, where species that are not related to each other evolve characteristics that cause them to have similar morphologies. Remember, morphology means the shape or form of something, because they have evolved to adapt to the same kind of niche. So here, for example, we're looking at marsupials. We're comparing marsupial mammals and placental mammals. So the placental mammals are on the left, and these are, humans are placental mammals. And all the mammals except for one, the possum in North America, are placental mammals. So we are most familiar with placental mammals. In Australia, however, there are all kinds of marsupial mammals. But you'll notice that, for example, there's a placental mole and a marsupial mole. They're not both moles because they are closely related to each other. They're not in the same order. They are both moles because they've adapted to the mole niche. So, for example, you know that moles have poor eyesight or very little eyesight at all. And both these species have that characteristic, not because they're closely related, not because they inherited that from a common ancestor, but because they live underground. And eyesight isn't important when you're living underground. So that's the idea of convergent evolution. The morphology of these animals has converged to look similar, and be similar because they've adapted to similar niches, not because of common ancestry. We call these similarities analogous. So again, the fact that moles have poor eyesight, that's analogous. That's an analogous characteristic or an analogous structure. So that's a vocabulary term you need to be aware of. It's the opposite of homologous. Homologous structures result from common ancestry. Analogous structures result from convergent evolution. This is a long-winded explanation of all these different examples, and I've already explained the marsupial example. We've also got an example comparing the wings of different species that are able to fly. So like the moth, the pterosaur, which is an extinct reptile, right? Flying reptile, birds, and bats. And so the idea here is that they all have wings, and the wings have similar morphology because they've all adapted to allow the species that have them to be able to fly. So the wings don't have similar morphology because of common ancestry. These species are very, very distantly related to each other. They have similar morphology because they've all adapted to the function of flight. That's the idea of convergent evolution. The evolution of the wing structure here has converged to allow these species to be able to fly. Fish, mammal, reptile, right? Very distantly related to each other. Therefore, the fact that they all have the same body shape, we call this the fusiform shape. They all have this fusiform shape, like bullet shape, so they can, they're hydrodynamic. They can glide through the water easily. That's an adaptation to living in an aquatic environment. So they don't look similar because they have common ancestry, close common ancestry. They look similar because they've adapted to be able to glide through the water more easily. That's convergent evolution. Their evolution has converged because they live in a similar niche. Eyes between the octopus and the vertebrate. In other words, your eye has this structure and an octopus's eye has this structure, not because we're closely related to octopi, but because of convergent evolution. Eye structure, it turns out there's one that this structure allows for forming a good, clear image. And both eyes have evolved to have that same structure because both of these kinds of organisms or species need to be able to form a nice, clear image. So they've converged. And then finally, this is an extreme example, but and it's a science fiction kind of example, that if dinosaurs had not gone extinct, that the ones that were bipedal, walking on two legs, may have evolved to become more humanoid-like, because we wouldn't be here. If dinosaurs had not gone extinct, we wouldn't be here, and possibly they may have evolved to fill our niche. Like I said, an extreme science fiction kind of example, but that's the idea of convergent evolution. So don't confuse convergent evolution with coevolution. They are kind of similar sounding words. Coevolution is something that we've seen before. It results from symbiotic relationships, both positive and negative symbiotic relationships. So what we're talking about are two or more species that evolve in response to selective pressures created by the other. In other words, they evolve together through time, and they evolve in response to each other's, to changes in each other. So for example, here we're looking at ants living on an acacia tree, and the acacia tree produces these oversized thorns that are hollow on the inside to allow the ants to live inside the thorns. So the ants live in the tree, they never leave the tree. The tree also produces food for the ants, a sugary substance. It secretes a sugary sap that the ants actually can eat. Now, why does the tree go to all this trouble to provide food and shelter for ants? Because the ants help protect the tree. So here's one scenario. Elephants like to eat acacia beans. Acacias produce bean pods, right? And elephants come along and they want to eat the beans. Well, believe it or not, teeny tiny ants are able to protect the acacia against elephants because they'll crawl up into the trunk of the elephant and start biting the elephant from inside its trunk. As you can imagine, that is a big deterrent to elephants. But this is a great example of coevolution, where the tree has adapted to allow for ants to live on it, and the ants have adapted to live nowhere else but this tree, and to have this behavior where they protect the tree. Another great example would be insects and flowers. Again, flowers evolved in plants as a way to use animals to disperse their pollen from flower to flower. And then insects have adapted to be able to take advantage of the pollen and the nectar that the flowers are offering up as food. So bees, for example, evolved to better be able to pick up pollen and pick up nectar from the flowers, and the flowers have adapted to attract the bees and provide the pollen, or make it easy for the bees to get the pollen and make it easy for the bees to get the nectar. So they have co-evolved. Another example, and this is a negative example, so both of those are mutualistic symbiotic relationships. More of a parasitic symbiotic relationship is the relationship between viruses and us. So viruses make us sick, right? But your body has evolved to be immune to, will evolve to be immune to viruses, but then the virus will change, will adapt, will evolve to make us sick again, and then will evolve to make us immune to the virus, and then the virus will mutate and evolve and change to make us sick again. And that's the whole scenario between the flu virus and us. So that's why you need a flu shot every year, because the virus mutates and changes and will make you sick again if you don't get a flu shot and build up that immunity. So there's like an arms race going on between pathogens that make us sick and our immune system that evolves to protect us from those pathogens. And then finally, we've got this like global example where life and the earth have kind of co-evolved, because life has had a huge impact on the conditions of the earth. The earth would be totally different if life had not evolved on the planet. You know, it wouldn't be green, it wouldn't be blue, it wouldn't have oxygen in the atmosphere. So that's the idea. Coevolution. Symbiotic. Two other patterns of evolution are known as gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. And it has to do with the idea that some species come into being. This is known as speciation. Speciation can be the result of slow, gradual change over long periods of time, but it can also be the result of very rapid change and rapid evolution over a relatively short period of time. So that's the difference here. And there's really no need I mean, there has been controversy about this and arguments about this between evolutionary biologists, but really there's no reason to argue. Probably both of these mechanisms are operating depending on conditions. If the species are evolving in a relatively stable environment, then we probably are going to see gradualism. And this is basically the idea that Darwin came up with too. Punctuated equilibrium, this came out of the fossil record because it appeared that species were evolving very rapidly and then not changing for long periods of time. So that rapid evolution that may have resulted from catastrophe is the punctuated part of punctuated equilibrium, and then the long periods of not changing. Notice that this species here isn't changing over this long period of time. It changes very rapidly when it first comes into being, but then it doesn't change at all for a very long period of time. And so it's in equilibrium. That's the equilibrium part of punctuated equilibrium. So again, depending on conditions, probably both of these are ways that species come into being, speciation. So just how rapid can rapid changes take place in evolution? So for example, the punctuated equilibrium. How is it that a species can change so fast in a relatively short period of time? Well, there are these very special sets of genes known as Hox genes, which is short for homeobox. Hox is short for homeobox, which simply means that there are a set of genes in the genome of a species. There's this set of genes, and it turns out that all animals have these Hox genes. So they appeared very early on in animal evolution, and they've been passed down. They're homologous in all animal species. They're master genes that regulate the expression of sets of other sets of genes involved in the development of whole body regions or structures. And if you watch that video from the evolution series, Great Transformations, they told the story of a couple scientists who were kind of trying to find these Hox genes, find the effect of one of these Hox genes in fruit flies. And that's a great example. So if you haven't watched that, I urge you to watch that. Insects are a good example of this because they are segmented. And like in that video, they were looking at fruit flies and how the different segments or body regions of the fruit flies were controlled by Hox genes. So in this example, in this figure, the idea is that ancient insects had the Hox genes active for creating wings in every one of their segments. Now you'll notice that some of the wings are bigger in some segments and smaller in other segments, but they were producing wings all along their body, probably for functions other than flight. And then a mutation in the Hox genes caused the wings to no longer form in all the segments, but only one or two segments. And this is the region of the body known as the thorax. And that's typically where wings are developing in insects today, is from the thorax. But the idea here is that it would take a relatively, because the Hox genes control other genes. The Hox genes are responsible for turning on the set of genes that forms the wings. That a mutation in a Hox gene can cause a huge change, a big change in a very short period of time, even one generation. So in other words, this could be the offspring of this species. Just in one generation, we can see the reduction in the number of wings, the reduction in wings being in every segment to being just in one segment and growing larger. So this change can happen virtually instantly. So mutations affecting location, in other words, where the Hox genes are turned on, is going to determine where the wings form. Mutations affecting timing can cause the structures to form at a different time. So, maybe the wings don't form until the insect is older. And then mutations affecting duration can cause structures to change in size. So in other words, the wings grow for a longer period of time, therefore they grow larger, as opposed to wings that grow for a shorter period of time and don't grow as large. So that's the idea, the power of the Hox genes to control the development of whole body regions and whole body structures. It's been suggested that mutations in Hox genes regulating the timing and duration of brain development could have produced larger brains in human ancestors. So just a little mutation in a Hox gene that would cause the brain to grow for a longer period of time during development may have resulted in our brains being larger. And larger brains have greater capacity to think, and that made our ancestors more successful, and so on. So they were selected for. I don't think anybody's done it, but there's a possibility of experimenting with that idea. Experimental evidence supporting this hypothesis may result from genetically engineering chimpanzees with the human gene responsible for brain development, with the human Hox gene responsible for brain development, to see if we could grow larger brains in chimpanzees, our closest relative. So that's the power of Hox genes. That's how species can evolve very quickly over a relatively short period of time